Hi everyone, welcome to ChessDiary number 2. It's Monday and it means today we will discuss endgames. And for today I thought we start with the basic pawn endings. So we will discuss two important themes today, which is key squares and opposition, because it's fundamental and very important to know for other endgames. The reason why I started with pawn endings is that it's the last remaining ending you will have to play, because once you have rooks they might become exchanged, and that means that a pawn ending will result in it. And this, I think it's very important to study them in deep, to get used to them, and also to get a certain knowledge in it, to know, or actually to evaluate position and to assess if it's good to transpose into a pure pawn ending or not. Okay, so for today, as I mentioned, we will discuss key squares and opposition. Key squares are those squares which enable the upper side to win the game. Doesn't matter whose turn it is. And yeah, actually the defending side tries to get control over these key squares and tries to prevent the opponent's king to get them in order to draw the game. Here in a given position, you see a highly instructive ending which highlights the opposition and key square theme. Let's take this pawn on d4. The pawn on d4 is lonely and does only have his king for protection, and he needs his king in order to be able to promote to a queen or rook, and finally to mate the opponent's king. Good. In order to get the key squares, we have to go 2 ranks up, and then we have those 3 key squares. It's very important. The key squares of a d4 pawn are c6, d6 and e6 in that given position. Other structures have other key squares, but in that given position it's c6, d6, e6 according to a d4 pawn. Okay, that means that the white king, once he will reach one of those 3 squares, he will definitely be able to help his pawn to promote, and the opponent's king of course has to do his best in order to prevent it. And it's actually even surprising how in blitz games how often even masters fail to apply the correct defensive technique, despite the fact that it's actually very basic and essential. And so we will look at it, and you will definitely be able to draw such a game or actually win such a game depending on whose turn it is. Okay, so as I mentioned, the key squares are c6, d6 and e6, and once the upper side, so the white king, gets control over these squares, he will definitely be able to decide the game. Okay, what means opposition? Opposition means, actually this kind of situation where the opponents see each other, they simply oppose each other. The point being that, according to rules, kings are not able to touch each other. That means, on the other hand, that there's always a certain gap between them, which is a barrier. Okay, this barrier is used, and actually the technique of position is only very useful if you can outmaneuver your opponent. That means that once your opponent's king sidesteps, we can outmaneuver him, in order to try to get another form of opposition. So simply to stop to the other side and then free the route for our pawn. So that's the basic idea behind it. Okay, so that's why actually having the opposition is very important. And once the kings are in opposition, as here in the given position, those player who has the turn, who has to move, is practically forced to give up the position. There are some exceptions. If he has some extra tempi left, let's say with a pawn or something like this, he will have some tempi. That's why it's also very important to save them and not to how to say, to rush with them and simply to spend them. It's very important to save tempi. Good. So in this position, let's say if it's black to move, he's actually forced to move either to e7 or to c7, and our technique, the technique of realizing the advantage of opposition is to sidestep, and we will get control over one of those key squares. Okay, so once we outmaneuvered our opponent, we've freed the route for our pawn, and with this secure the possibility to queen him, to promote him finally. Okay, so let's see. We go back. So it doesn't matter which way the opponent's king goes, we will simply sidestep and then try to get control over the last 3 squares here in order to be able to promote our pawn. I call this actually the traffic light. That's why I call our kids, because it's easier for them to remember. And once you reach the traffic light, you will have green light and free route to promotion. And it's very important that you get control over this. Once you reach this, you will definitely be able to promote your pawn. Once your king is in front of your pawn, of course. Okay, so it means the technique of realizing the advantage if it's actually black to move in this position. Okay, but if it's white to move, black is using their position in order to prevent a sidestep by our king. And that means that a move such as king c7 is of course wrong, because now we will be able to reach the position we had before with white. We get the opponent gets the opposition, but we have this extra tempi, which means we move our pawn. In that case, even with check, so the opponent's king has to move. He moves, we take the opposition, and now we got our traffic light, which means that our pawn will definitely promote. Okay, so thus the defending side has to keep the opposition in order to prevent such a sidestep by our own king with king e7. So once again, keep him up this barrier, and our opponent cannot sidestep the opponent's king. Good. So after king e5, king e7, the only possible move in order to prevent any move transpositions, actually repetitions, is to advance the pawn here with d5. Okay. Once you advance a pawn, the key squares also actually shift or actually move. According to rule, it's always 2 ranks above and then those 3 squares in a row. Okay, so now the key squares are c7, d7 and e7. Okay, the opponent's king does already control the squares, and it's very difficult, actually in that case even impossible, to get control over these squares without moving the pawn. So the point being that here we would like to have the opposition by means of king d5, but the point being that our pawn is in front of taking the spot, and due to this the opponent does have the opposition, and actually prevents us from taking the opposition, and thus prevents a sidestep indirectly. Okay, and because of this, it's also very important that you keep your king in front of your pawn, because once your pawn is at least at the height of your pawn, it means that the opposition will very often be actually fail, because the pawn takes away a very important square which our own king might need for the opposition itself. Okay, so after d7, the only reasonable move is d6, I think, and with a pawn in front of the upper side's king, it's actually drawn. So let's see, we sidestep, once again using the fact that our opponent cannot take the opposition on d6 as it's taken by the pawn. So a very important difference is that we should not allow our opponent to actually, as black, we should not allow white to get the opposition, because after king d8 and d7 there is no stalemate trick, and he has to move, and the only move he has is to c7. After this we control this squares and finally promote our pawn. Okay, that means that king d8 is the right defensive move, and the difference is, I think, pretty obvious. After king e6 we now take the position as black, and after d7 king d8 is actually white to move, and he has only one square where he can protect his pawn as he is forced to move, and after king d6 it's stalemate and therefore drawn. So that's the basic algorithm and technique to either realize the advantage with king and pawn versus king with a non-rook pawn, and actually to defend the side, being a pawn down by keeping the opposition. That's very essential and very important rule of thumb. Keep the opposition by any means. Okay, good, so that's for it. And now let's move to another example. With a pawn on the 5th rank already, there are additional key squares available. That means with a pawn on b5, according to our rule of our previous example, the key squares are a7, b7 and c7. But with a pawn on the 5th rank, there are additional key squares which are a6, b6 and c6. It's very important to remember. That means that actually black cannot prevent us from taking any to take the control of any key squares, as we are already control them. That means that he will definitely lose by force if we don't fall for the stalemate trick that's able with the knight pawn. Okay, so let's see how it works. Okay, what I would like to mention is that according to Carsten Muller, a very important, famous endgame theoretician and expert, as a very strong chess player, there's a term which he call good technique. The point being that here white has many ways to win, but there is only one clear and clean win, and that's why I call good technique. So let's see the difference. Let's say after the good move, a good technique is king a6 for instance, and now king a8, because after king c8 we move to a7 and got our traffic light. So king a8, b6, the king has to move, b8 on new move, b7 taking away the corner from the opponent's king, he has to move, and now we simply promote our pawn next move and win by a simple checkmate technique, with a queen and king versus lone king. Okay, the point why I call this the good technique is that after king c6 white has to surpass a certain trap. Let's see, after king a7, let's say he moves to king c7. We of course also have controlled this, but the point being that there are some stalemate tricks, and after king a8, the point being that we cannot play b6 because it's stalemate. The opponent's king cannot move anymore without a check, and that means that the game is drawn by stalemate. Okay, so that means that after king a7, of course in that case b6, king a8, and now let's say b7, king b8. It's once again the problem that the pawn can only be defended by b6, and this leads to a stalemate, to a basic stalemate which we saw in a previous example. And after king c7 we have our stalemate from before. So that means that after king a7 the correct move is king c7, after king a8 to go to b6. The opponent gets the opposition, and it's actually the starting position we have, and now simply correct it with a6, and this will simply decide the game. Good. So it's very important that you, with knight pawn, that you remember the trick with the stalemate. Actually, most stalemates, or even all stalemates, are possible due to the corner, because we have a certain wall here at the edge of the board, on the rim, and that means that those tricks are usually only available there. Okay, that's also the reason why rook pawns has such a high drawing tendency. Good. So let's move to the next example. Okay, that's also highly instructive and a very important thing to remember. Here we definitely see that the pawn on b4 has key squares a6, b6 and c6. Okay, so in order to fight for them, both kings are far away, we have to go for a race. A race to control the key squares. It's very important. So Black's king will definitely go something like king d7, king d6, king c5 in order to control these key squares. And it's very important that we choose our route. The point being, we have of course, okay, I think Black's route is pretty obvious as he tries to get the key square which is next to him. But we have two different routes. The point being, which one should we choose? As a rule of thumb, I would suggest you to remember that it's always better to aim for the key square most distanced to your opponent's king. So that means we should aim for the a6 square, as it takes much longer for the opponent to reach it. And I think that's a very important rule of thumb which you should remember. So let's see, king c7, king d6, king b3, king d6, all according to our plan or calculation. And now let's say the difference is seen in king c4 in order to aim for the for the b6 or c6 key squares. The opponent gets the opposition. Our pawn gets in front of our king, and that means the position is completely wrong. It should be no problem anymore. So after king d6, we should aim for the most distanced key square, which is a6. And after king c5, the opponent definitely gets control of the key square, the c5. The point being that he cannot hold it anymore. It's not only important to to get them, but also to keep the control of the key squares. And now after king a5, the point being that it's some kind of a body check. The opponent king would like to stay on the 6th rank. It's not possible anymore. He has to go. Let's say after king c7, we simply play king a6, and the opposition doesn't help because we have our extra tempi. And after b5, the opponent king moves, we take the opposition, produce our traffic light, and win the game. Okay. So after king a5, let's say he goes to b7. Now it's very important that we take over the opposition, therefore forcing him to move, and therefore forcing him to give up the control over one of these key squares. So let's say after b7, a7, we go to d6, c6 to outmaneuver our opponent. Then, okay, a6 is not a help because we have our extra tempi. After this, we once again have this light. b6 is a common mistake actually, because it leads to the stalemate trick we seen previously. And after king c7, it's stalemate, or let's say b7. It's the basic defending technique by stalemate, and the game is drawn. So very important after king a7 to go king c7 in order to control these squares, and after king a8 to go king d6. Very important. This does not help because he simply goes back, and if he moves, d6 is again stalemate. So it means we have to go to b6, and after king b8, move to a6. Promote and mate. Okay. So don't forget this stalemate trick with the knight pawn. Okay. This is also very important. Actually, one of the most beautiful examples I've ever seen. The point being that it's also some kind of a race, because the opponent's king tries. Okay, white's king is much nearer to the opponent's king pawn, and okay, the defending side, the black player, has tried to get control over this key squares in order to draw the game. And okay, let's see how it went. The key squares of this pawn actually, okay, the rook pawn, that means that the key squares actually are here, because with the rook pawn left, we only have to go to the corner in order to save the game. So let's see. In order to win this, let's say king f2. If he tries to, to win the race, which we should also calculate, we have to look if we are much faster than our opponent. And after king g3, king e5, king h4, king f5, we actually won the game, as okay, our king will simply support our pawn to promote, and therefore we win the game easily. Okay. That means that after king f2, king d7 is definitely lost, so h4 is necessary. And it's also very important because, okay, the point being that our king does not have the g3 square available anymore. That means that we have to choose a bigger route in order to control this. And the point being that there are also some stalemate tricks possible here, and it's very important that king f3 is a mistake and practically refuted by h3. Okay, the idea behind h3 is that after taking, we get a king and pawn versus king ending, but with a rook pawn. And with a rook pawn, the defender's task is only to go to the corner in order to control these two squares, after which it's definitely stalemate and drawn. So let's see. He gets it just in time, and the position is drawn, as we will see in our next example. But let's now move on to h3. If we move to g3, for instance, the king has got time, because king g4 definitely loses because the pawn promotes. That means that this square is not available, and he needs some time in order to free the route to the pawn and to get him. And that's enough time for the opponent's king to get these three key squares. Okay, so g4, king e5, king g3, king f6, king h3, and now the pawn is in front of the upper side's king. That means that the game is drawn. Okay, so after h4, g4 does not help either, because we will simply give up this pawn as black and try to get this key squares here. So that means after, let's say king d7, king g3, king e6, king h3, king f6, and now let's say king h4 is simply drawn as we control the key squares. And after something like this, we simply get the opposition, and the king moves. You cannot get the opposition anymore because of the pawn, and the game is drawn easily. Okay, so that means king f3 is a pretty important, important mistake to know. And the point being that you have to judge the position completely new once this pawn moved to h4, because okay, black's idea is that once we change this, he simply goes to the corner. But this pawn moved actually even one rank away from the opponent's king. That means that he needs one move more in order to reach it. Okay, so that means that we saw that the direct race is definitely lost for black. And with h4, he actually burdened him, or actually himself. He actually forced himself to spend one move more in order to stop, to protect his pawn. That means that we got practically or theoretically one move for free. Okay, that's for it. But the key squares did also somehow moved. So let's see how we can actually use the fact. As we saw, king f3 loses, there's only one move left, king g1. Okay, and okay, if he tries to protect it, we simply get the pawn and support our own pawn in order to win the game. So that's the algorithm we already know and learned by our previous examples. So that means that here, for instance, h3 is the last trick Of course, g takes h3 is simply drawn as the king goes to the corner. That means after h3 he moves to g3. After king d7, king h2. We are just in time to control the most advanced key square, and the game is won. Okay. But what's about g4 here? The point being that, with a pawn on g3, the key squares are on the 5th rank. So 2 ranks away from the opponent's king. With a pawn on g4, on the other hand, it's on the 6th rank. That means that the opponent is much closer to it, and it's most likely, or actually more likely, that you will be able to reach them, and we have to calculate if it's possible. In that case, let's see, king d7, king h2, king e6, king h3, and he got control of the key squares. So it means that g4 can even spoil all our advantage. So keep in mind the key squares. It's very important that you make it as hard as possible for our opponent's king to get them, and to maintain the control over them, and try to secure the key squares for your own king if you have a pawn up. Okay, so it's a very important thing to remember. Good. So I think for today we got plenty ideas and motives in order to get to understand key squares. Always go 2 ranks above, and then these 3 squares. We got a better feeling for key squares, and of course also the technique of opposition, and actually the way the upper side uses this by let's say sidestepping the opponent's king, and then try to produce that, let's call it graphic light, in order to secure the promotion of our pawn. What's also very important here is that rook pawns, with rook pawns, it's also very important for the defensive side to get control over the, let's say with an h4 pawn, for instance. It's very important that the black king gets control over the crucial g8 and g7 key squares. With a knight pawn on a 5th, there are additional key squares available. And all in all, we go 2 ranks up, and then have those 3 key squares of each pawn. Here, for instance, as you can see, the position from g4 pawn, we go through 2 ranks up, and then we have those 3 squares, f6, g6, and h6. So that's very important that you keep this in mind. And also with a knight pawn, one has to remember the stalemate trick. Don't forget this, as it can spoil anything. And so I think you got a lot of motives now for your own play. And in our next clip, I think endings are on Wednesday. We will continue our work on endings and discuss further examples of opposition, and actually also 2 very funny examples in which 2 masterclass players actually ignored the fact that key squares exist, and either gave up the game with the wrong chances available, or simply ignored it and lost the game due to a very bad mistake. Okay, so thank you for watching, and check out the channel for the new latest videos, and feel free to comment on them and to subscribe on my channel. I will try to produce a new clip almost every day, so keep track with it, and so see you next time, and bye.